Hello, welcome to this short little video revising Romeo and Juliet. We're going to focus on the nurse in this video. Obviously we can't cover everything, we're just going to go for a few things just to help you with your revision and preparing for exams. The first thing we're going to do is just look at where the character features in the story. And one of the things you're going to have to think about in the exam when you're planning your questions, thinking where else do we see this character? So if we look at the story, we see her in Act 1. And in Act 1 we see her in the first conversation between Lady Capulet, the nurse, and Juliet when they're talking about marrying Paris. And then we see her again at the end of Act 1 where she's at the party and she informs Romeo of Juliet's identity. Then in Act 2 she's the one that interrupts them in the balcony, and then later in that scene she becomes a bit of a messenger. So in Act 2 Scene 4 she's the one that goes and passes a message between Romeo and Juliet and informing about the marriage, and then she goes and tells Juliet about it at the end of the act. But then in Act 3 she's the one that informs Juliet of Tybalt's death, and she's the one that afterwards goes to Friar Lawrence to try and resolve the problem with Romeo and Juliet and their relationship. And then she also, at the end of Act 3, she's the one that consoles Juliet when she discovers the plans to carry on marrying Paris, even though she's married Romeo at this time. And then in Act 4 we move on and we see her basically taking a less of a position in the story, and we see her watching Juliet agree to her father's instructions to marry Paris. Then she sees Juliet before she takes the potion, and then afterwards she's the one that discovers Juliet is supposedly dead. And so from that point on she disappears from the story completely. So that gives you a rough idea of the character itself. Now what we're going to do is just have a look at a few scenes and a few extracts to do with the character, to give you a bit of a better understanding of the character itself. So if we look at Act 1, now remember, you don't have to remember everything about the text. You just got to be able to say some interesting things about it and remember a few quotations and a few lines. Now what we've got here are a couple of speeches from her, and I've highlighted a few things that kind of draw attention to things that we've got in the language that you can kind of talk about and you can use when talking about the nurse herself. So if we have a look, the way that she talks is quite interesting for us. Now the first thing is, very clearly, is that she uses a very informal term of address, thou. Okay, if you wanted to be very, very formal and distant and respectful in a relationship, you would use what we use as you as a pronoun, whereas if you wanted to show that you were close to somebody, you'd use thou. So you can see here straight away the nurse talks to Juliet in a very informal way, which reflects the closeness of the relationship, and the fact that she describes her in terms of an animal. Okay, an often sweet, gentle relationship that suggests that Juliet is innocent and sweet and somehow needs protecting. So we can kind of see that protective nature of the nurse straight away. We've also got the nurse who's very honest and direct. So the opening line that the nurse talks about is by her virginity, her maidenhead, which obviously in Act 1 Scene 1 we've seen virginity referred to by the men in the story. But also she's quite happy to talk about the testicles of a cockerel as well, and talking about falling on people's backs. And so she's very, very confident in talking about sexual things and things of a sexual nature. She's quite open and honest about it. So there's no kind of manners about it. So it shows that she's quite a direct and honest character. but also the fact that she can talk about these things in front of Juliet and also Lady Capulet, so that she's quite a comfortable and confident character. Now, another sign of this is also the fact that she does talk quite a lot. And when you look at her speeches in the first half of the play, where she takes quite an active role in the story, she tends to talk more than the other characters, which shows that she's very, very comfortable and she's a confident character. If you talk a lot, you're confident. She's also a comic character. So the fact that she's talking about a young cockerel stone and the fact that Juliet bumped her head and it's as big as a cockerel stone is quite a comical thing. And actually, she serves a purpose, a bit like Mercutio, in that she is the play's comedy. She's coming up with very, very comic lines. And, you know, people would find this very, very funny. So she's kind of an interesting character from that kind of angle. She's a comic character. She's bawdy, so a lot of the time the humour is kind of a sexual nature, but she does appeal to the audience, because that's one way you can get people to like you, is through humour. And so she appeals to the audience and their kind of comical, kind of earthy humour. But at the same time as that, she's focusing on the physical aspects of love. Now, if we think about Juliet and Romeo and their love is kind of in a romantic concept. It's all about, you know, this kind of spiritual meeting of souls together and how they're going to die together and be, you know, perfect together, and this idea of being angelic and beautiful love. But actually, what we've kind of got is more of a realistic view of kind of man and woman relationships, of the kind of the sexual element, the connection physically. Hence why a lot of her language tends to be about the physical aspects of a relationship, and link that into Mercutio, because Mercutio does exactly the same thing. He's more interested in the physical aspect rather than the emotional, spiritual aspect. Now, another thing we can say about this is also the way that the nurse dotes on Juliet like a mother would, and this whole reflected in the fact that it calls her a lamb. Now, there's a sad story behind the nurse, and Shakespeare adds depth even to the kind of the smaller characters in the story, is the fact that we know that the nurse has lost her daughter, and we also know that she's lost her husband. And so for us in this story, her relationship with Juliet is very, very important, because she's got nobody. And so you can see how she dotes on her. And she, in a way, for the nurse, Juliet is a replacement child. And really, that she sees her daughter in Juliet. So that shows that how close that relationship is itself. So that's how she comes across in Act 1. This close, honest character, very, very comfortable, comic and bawdy. Now, by the time we get to Act 3, the nurse kind of changes in her role. And so we move from this kind of this loving character to being a little bit melodramatic. And so in Act 3, after the fight, we have the nurse talking about Tybalt's body. And if we have a look at how she describes the body, and she describes the wound and the mark, and you can see that really she could have said less and still got the idea there, but she dwells in it. She's melodramatic, means to be over the top. It's exaggerated kind of style, but she focuses on the blood and the gore. Clearly she's shocked by it, as would everybody else be shocked by it, but the way she describes it is incredibly over the top, and it kind of reflects in a way the character changing in here. But also what's quite interesting is that this idea of gender stereotypes there. So she swooned at the sight, so she kind of fainted because of the sight of it. But you know, she describes the manly breast, and you can see that even though she's quite a very, very kind of modernish character and being quite open and honest and quite strong, in this situation, she tends to follow kind of a stereotypical gender stereotype in that, you know, she describes the man as manly, okay, yet she faints at the sight of blood. And so it raises an interesting question here about, is she a strong character or is she just pretending to be a strong character to the scene? Now, the other thing that we have in Act 3 is really how she changes. Now, we get the sense in Act 1 of how she views Paris, and she describes Paris as being very, very attractive, and she focuses on the physical aspects of him. But then Romeo turns up, and in Act 2 she's talking about how attractive Romeo is. Now, what's quite interesting is in Act 3 we kind of have a sudden change, and we see with the nurse how quickly she changes. It goes from Paris to Romeo and then back to Paris, and it's actually kind of suggesting some ideas about how men are presented. So for example, if we have a look, there's no trust, no faith, no honesty in men. Now we'll see that this happens quite a lot. Repetition is one of the things to look out with the nurse, because she repeats things, just as you got here. I saw the wound, I saw it with mine eyes. Okay, we have that repetition again and again. And here we've got it, no trust, no faith, no honesty. And we can see that we've got the repetition of these abstract nouns, trust, faith, honesty. So you can see how this repetition is there. But also it shows us how she doesn't trust men. And actually she's quite quick to move on. And I use this phrase mercenary. Now mercenary means kind of like you're focused more about, you know, what you can get out of it more than anything. And so it really shows at this point that maybe the nurse has got this, well, mercenary approach in going, well, which man is the best at the time? It's not about falling in love with who you're meant to be with. It's possibly about a mercenary approach. Who's the best person at this time? And obviously Romeo's killed somebody, so do you know what? Paris is the best person to be with at the moment. Don't worry that you've married him before. No, we can fix that. Paris. So she's got this very, very practical approach to dealing with things. But also another thing that we get with the nurse is she is a character that constantly moans about her age and highlighting how old she is. And so you have a look out when you see a quote or a speech from the nurse about that, because she'll talk about her bones ache, and the whole thing we have in terms of comedy is her going on about she can't talk because she's so out of breath. And so you can see that we do have an issue about age and ageism here, that the nurse represents old people. Then we get to Act 4. Now, Act 4 marks for me probably the saddest thing, and I think it's quite cruel what happens in the story from a story point of view. We know how much the nurse loves Juliet, and yet Shakespeare makes her be the first person to discover that she is supposedly dead. And it's interesting that we don't see the nurse again, because I think it would be doubly cruel if she discovered she was alive and then came back and then died again. I think that would make it even more worse. But I find this bit quite a cruel thing, because what Dickens does is, not Dickens, Shakespeare, okay, is this whole idea of dramatic irony. We know what's happening, but what we're seeing in this bit here with the discovery of Juliet being supposedly dead is the whole emotions that's going through. And we start with the excitement. You know, the nurse is excited. The girl who she treats like a daughter is going to be married. She is happy about that, yet she then discovers that she is dead. And that marks a change in the way that the character talks. Now, if we look at the opening bit, it's very much how she has always spoken. we've got that caring aspect to it. Lamb, which shows the caring nature that she's got. We see the repetition, we see her talking a lot, being feel quite comfortable, and we also see that, you know, she's focusing on the sexual aspect of their relationship. So you can see that, you know, keeps referring to aspects about what she's going to do with her husband. But then when you look at it and the discovery, and I'd say there's quite an interesting change between that. So when she starts to realise what's happened, is that the way that she speaks changes completely. Now, she's a character that waffles a lot. She does. Okay, she gives anecdotes, she gives stories, she talks about other things. But then when she discovers that Juliet's dead, and usually as a character who's got so many things to say, ends up saying very, very little. And it's actually quite interesting to look at Capulet, Lady Capulet, and the nurse. Whereas the nurse is the one that usually talks the most. In this situation, she's the one that talks the least. And actually, the Capulets start talking the most. And for me, I feel that this is a point where actually the character is broken. And we have got that typical repetition that she has. But that's it. That's the line that she has. She goes from this confident talking, whittling about stuff, to suddenly this. And for me, I think that marks a change in the character. And the fact that I would say that the nurse at this point is heartbroken. She can't talk at all. She doesn't want to talk. And I think that choice of language in there, from a character that waffles all the time to now being a character that doesn't want to talk, because there's nothing she can say. There's nothing she wants to say. So I think that's quite an interesting way to look at it. And obviously a clear reason why she doesn't come back. Like other characters in the story that disappear and never come back, it's almost as if they've been broken by what's happened. Benvolio disappears. A character who played a slight part in the beginning of the play just doesn't appear after the fight. He disappears. And the same here, the nurse. She doesn't appear later on in the story. Now, there are so many things that we can say about the nurse as a character. But what you've got to do is think of some of your own ideas. Now, I'm going to give you some ideas of things you could say and some phrases. And what I'd say is try to have some phrases in your head to talk about some of these characters. So you have a starting point. We know that it could be any of the characters or any of the themes in the story. And so what we've got to be able to do is come up with some ideas about it. So how does Shakespeare present the nurse? Well, we could see her as being a surrogate mother. Her mother isn't good enough for her, and so we've got the nurse as a surrogate mother, a replacement mother. We could also see that she's the heart and the emotion of the play. At the centre of the story, we do have Romeo and Juliet, but also we have the relationship between Juliet and the nurse. And we've got in the story two mothers that lose their daughters. And we're seeing that kind of emotional connection to these characters. And as I showed you before, that kind of broken character, that when she discovers she's dead, she's got no meaning left in the story. Another way to view the nurse is that she's a mature, experienced view of the world. Juliet is very much an idealistic, optimistic, romantic character. She falls in love, she's guided by her emotions, and as soon as she meets Romeo, she's madly in love. The nurse has lived her life. She's had children, she's had a husband. She's a mature view of the world. She sees things differently, hence why she's quick for her to move on to Paris. Forget about Romeo, move on. She knows what's more important in life because she's got the experience of things. We could view her as a comical character. She does create comedy. But also we can see her as a symbol of class. She is of the lower classes, and that's part of the comic appeal. Shakespeare does tend to give comedy to the lower classes in the stories. They can be more bawdy and they can be more comical with their ideas. But also there is a problem in that, is that they are limited. If we think about the story of Romeo and Juliet, the nurse cannot do much. She's got very, very little power. And if you see later on in Act 3 and 4 how Capulet treats her, she tries to stand up for Juliet and Capulet puts her in her place. To be poor meant that you didn't have a say in society. She also gives a realistic view of situations because she's mature and experienced, which is opposing to Juliet's view. She's also the antithesis. Now, antithesis means kind of the opposite. So whereas Juliet represents this idea of romantic love and chivalry and having a man come in to rescue and save you, she, the nurse, represents the opposite, a kind of a basic practical love that we've got about the basics. But also the nurse presents an idea of what mother should be. And if we look at her in comparison to Juliet's mother, we see two different types of mother. We see a very cold, distant mother in Capulet, Lady Capulet, but then we see a warm, cuddly mum in terms of the nurse. And actually, we kind of see a nurse that possibly, a mother that we would all want in this nurse character itself. Now, those are just some ideas, okay? You can obviously come up with your own ideas, all right? But what we suggest is plan to have something so you can say some ideas already before you start writing. Now, added to that, we want you to be thinking about choices. Now in front of you here I've got a number of choices, and at any point you can just pause this video and just think, why do I think Shakespeare's made these choices? Now often when we think about writing about Shakespeare, we think of choices to do with things like similes, metaphors, verbs, repetition, those sorts of things. But actually there's lots of other choices in the story that we could easily talk about. And sometimes they're a lot easier because you don't have to remember specific quotes and particular things. So if you want to, pause the video now. If not, I'm going to talk you through some possible choices that we can talk about. Now, if we have a look at the first choice that we've got here, it's interesting that the nurse speaks more than Lady Capulet. Now, what we could say in that is actually the richer you get, or the more sophisticated you get, the less emotional that you are. And so actually you lose your ability to connect with people and your emotions. So if we think about the problem in the story, is the fact that the relationship between the parents and their children doesn't quite work. And so the parents have distanced themselves quite a bit from Juliet. And so even when Juliet wants to talk to her parents, they won't talk to her properly. And so what we see is through the fact that the nurse speaks the most, shows that connection, but there is a comfortableness about the way that nurse feels around Juliet. And that links into that idea of the choice about why make the nurse more affectionate than Lady Capulet. Well, clearly that the more money you have, the less emotional you are. And we know that's not necessarily true, but we're talking from the story. From the story point of view, that's what we're seeing. And this obsession about, status and how the world views you is at the heart of this story. And it's ironic that the play ends with a promise that they're going to put a Juliet into a statue of gold. And this idea that, their emphasis is on what they want rather than what's best for their child. And you see that quite interestingly at the start of the play, because Capulet starts with this idea that Juliet's not quite ready to marry, and then suddenly in the story he changes that and he's trying to push for Juliet to marry Paris. And so you can see that at the heart of this story is a problem. Do parents consider the views and the feelings of the children? If they did, then they would have stopped a lot of the problems here. So we can see that in that affectionate. So the way that the nurse is more affectionate than Lady Capulet and Lord Capulet shows this idea. But also, she's the person that leaves the house more than Juliet. That's quite interesting, because what that shows us is how trapped Juliet is. And if we want to take the idea of kind of like fairy tale, Juliet seems to be trapped in a tower, doesn't she? The nurse isn't. So by being poor, you have more freedom as a woman. But also there is a difference, because Juliet isn't married, or not until parents are aware of it. So actually, to become married changes your status in society, whereas the nurse can leave freely, Juliet can't. And also the choice to have Juliet be found by the nurse first. As I mentioned before, that's quite an interesting choice for Shakespeare to make. You'd automatically assume that it would be the parents that find the child. But actually in the story it's the nurse. But that shows you how there isn't that much connection and they're quite distant. And finally, the choice of making her disappear. We could have had her appear in Act 5 right at the end, but Shakespeare doesn't. And for me, I think that's the saddest thing, because I think that tells us that she is broken. She's broken by what's happened. She's lost one daughter and now she's lost another daughter. So there are just some choices. So when you think about Shakespeare and you think about one of the characters, think about some of the story choices. Think about some of the structural choices that we can make. We're not just thinking about certain techniques, we're thinking about choices that the writer's made in the story. Why has the writer done this rather than this? And often there's a lot that we can talk about, and they're often quite easy to write about. Now, talking about the audience's reaction is also another way that we can explore what Shakespeare is doing. So if we think about the way that the nurse is presented to us, and just in the same way that kind of like a pantomime, you have characters that you like and dislike, Shakespeare's trying to do that with his characters. He's trying to show characters that we like, characters that we don't like. If we think about Tybalt, Tybalt's there for it to really dislike, and he's going to cause a problem for the characters that we do like. The nurse is an interesting character because I would say that Shakespeare, from the beginning, is trying to make us warm to the character, to really like them, okay? Because he uses humour to do that. We find her funny, she says silly things, a little bit rude, but also the fact that she's got a backstory makes us kind of empathise with her. And we kind of support what she's doing. And we kind of relate to what's going on. So as a character, Shakespeare is doing that. Now I think that's quite important, because by making us warm to the nurse, what Shakespeare's then doing is creating the opposite reaction with Lady Capulet. And that's quite a telling point. So the audience will like the nurse and dislike Lady Capulet. And that's quite an interesting thing when we think about how Shakespeare manipulates us as the audience, because a lot of the time the nurse is going against Lady and Lord Capulet. So in the story, think about how Shakespeare creates that and why he creates that and what's the purpose to do with that. Because then we can start looking about the choices, and we can look about some specific choices. Now these are just some things, and obviously you're only going to talk about one or two of these things, but to give you an idea of what we could talk about. So really, Shakespeare's using the nurse to be a contrast to the parents, and especially Lady Capulet. And this idea of how she shows them how they should behave. So she's kind of a symbol of the caring part of society. And if we think about it, we've got the friar who represents the moral aspect of society. She is representing the caring part of society. And notice the nurse and the title with a nurse. And what do nurses do? They heal, they fix, they mend. And so what you can see in the story is that's what she's trying to do, fix situations, to heal things. And so when Juliet's supposedly dead, she can't do that anymore, can she? But also she's the voice of the lower classes. She's the voice of the lower classes in Elizabethan society. But she's also the kind of the down to earth approach to things. She's got that very, very clear, direct things. She'll say it as it is. She won't have manners, but she says it as it is. The very, very basic kind of approach to things. But also we can kind of link it connections with other characters, because the nurse and also the friar, okay, by having those two different characters, we see different parts of society. We see the healing, but also we see the moral judgment. We also see this idea of being kind of focusing on a realistic view to love, and then we've got this kind of religious view towards love. So actually, you know, Shakespeare's putting those different ideas there together. Now we're nearly at the end, okay, so when we've got our choices, we've got our ideas, we need to kind of develop and explore those a little bit further. Now, here's kind of a start of a paragraph. It's not a full paragraph, but it's the start of one. So once we've spotted our idea and we've said what our idea is, so Shakespeare presents the nurse as a woman who will speak her mind, okay, and we've talked about our choice. Shakespeare shows the character speaking more than Lady Capulet to echo how sophisticated women were expected to be silent and to have a voice in society. We then need to kind of expand and explain. And in English, you get the marks from explaining. It's not the number of ideas, but from the explaining. And so here, several good words for you to use to explore. So based on this idea, based on your evidence, what is Shakespeare doing? Now remember, we don't know what Shakespeare is actually doing. We're kind of making up an idea that we think. So what do we think here? So challenging, questioning, highlighting and attacking are good words to get you to kind of start talking about what Shakespeare's doing. Now you don't need to know a lot about Elizabethan England. You kind of know quite a bit of it because you've read the play. The play has got all the stuff that you need to know about Elizabethan England. But what you can do is talk about the ideas. So this idea, Shakespeare is highlighting how powerless women were in society. Lady Capulet doesn't have a say. She's quiet. She's voiceless. And if we think about Juliet, Juliet's locked away in her house. She's got no voice. She's hidden away. And when she tries to speak, her father threatens to kick her out of the house and disown her. So we see that idea. Here's also Shakespeare is challenging how men control all aspects of Elizabethan society. If we look at this story, Lady Capulet is silent, and that's because her husband wants her to be silent. He instructs her to do things, but she doesn't do things off her own back. And so we see how men are controlling women. And we even see that later on at the end of the play, where the father tries and tells Juliet what to do, and how unhappy he is when she doesn't follow his instructions, and how angry he is towards the nurse when she stands up to him. We also see how society forces you to behave in a particular way. So, for example, the nurse, because she isn't sophisticated and because she hasn't been schooled and she hasn't been trained to behave, she is quite open and quite direct. A bit rude, but quite honest with it at the same time. What Lady Capulet shows is that actually society makes you behave in a particular way. And Lady Capulet is behaving the way that she is because society has told her to behave that way. But also Shakespeare could be teaching us this idea that women have an inner strength. And what we see in the play itself is with Juliet and the nurse are two strong women who are trying to fight a system that is controlling them. Juliet tries to escape and uses extreme methods to do that. The nurse has got a very, very clear inner strength herself. But also, what Shakespeare might be kind of raising or showing us is how women let men take control. And particularly look at Lady Capulet and look at what happens to the nurse. The nurse becomes quite silent and submissive in Act 4. As soon as she starts standing up to Capulet and he has a go at her, she becomes quiet. So you can see that there are a number of different ideas there behind the character itself. And it just gives you an idea of the sort of things that you could talk about. Now the last thing that I'm going to kind of talk about is just some things that kind of push your thinking and where you could go. Now what we want you to do in the actual exam itself is we want you to think. We don't just want you to kind of repeat everything your teacher's told you or everything you've found online or even everything in this video. What we want you to do is to do some thinking. So these are some of the things that you could kind of think about and see if you've got some ideas, and you can relate them to when you're talking about the character later. Starting off, are Mercutio and the nurse the same character? Are they both representing the audience in some way? They both, as mentioned before, have got this bawdy sexual nature. They're both comic characters and they're both close to Romeo and Juliet. And both disappear towards the middle of the play. Is the nurse proof that Romeo and Juliet should be a comedy? That's one of the ideas that's gone around quite a bit, is that possibly in the same way that Midsummer Night's Dream is a comedy, but you've got the Pyramus and Thisbe story within it, is this idea that is Romeo and Juliet supposed to be a bit of a spoof of a tragedy? Is it meant to be a comic story? And is it just comedy with a tragic ending? Or is it a tragedy with a little bit of comedy? So that's an interesting question to ask yourself, because the nurse clearly has a part to do with that comedy. Another idea is to think about gender presentation. Does Shakespeare present women as emotionally strong but physically weak? Or is it the other way? And one thing to think about is Macbeth. Okay, how does Macbeth show how women are presented? Are we seeing similar ideas that we saw with Lady Macbeth and the witches that we're seeing here in Romeo and Juliet? And we can bring in other Shakespeare plays. Just because we're talking about Romeo and Juliet, you can bring in other plays. That shows the examiner that you've got an understanding of other plays. And exactly that question, is this typical of what Shakespeare does? Another thing to think about is Shakespeare simplifying women? In his plays, are women either mothers, wives and daughters? Is the play reductive in roles, or is he doing something interesting with it? So there's another question for you. Also, is Shakespeare mocking the nurse in his portrayal, or is he sympathetic towards her? Modern readers, and I certainly have taken that view, that possibly it's quite sympathetic, but maybe is Shakespeare mocking the nurse? Is she the comedy? It's not the fact that she's saying rude stuff, but is it the fact that she's there to be laughed at, to mock and to make fun of her? And then finally, does the way and her poverty, does that affect the way that she behaves? Is that a key reason for behind the way she behaves? And if so, why? There are just some ideas to get you thinking. Okay, we don't expect you to answer every single question, and certainly don't mention every single thing here in your essay. You've got to decide which one is right or what idea works for you. Okay, but certainly go away, spend some time thinking with these characters and these questions itself. Okay, that's the end of the video now, and we will keep this video up here, and we'll be adding more as we go along, so please do subscribe to our YouTube channel and check up for updates. Thank you.